Hi everyone, I'm Amy Kessler, and today I'll be talking to you about new media theory and how the internet has transformed society. I'll start by giving you a little bit of background of the theory and then moving on to answering how the internet has transformed society. And I'll do that by looking at a few different types of new media that are available and some of the positive and negative influences of each of those. And then I'll conclude by looking at the theory from a biblical perspective and sharing some of the ways that the church has approached new media. So new media theory was developed by Mark Poster in the early 1990s, and it's derived from Marshall McLuhan's medium theory, which addresses how media shapes society. And Mark Poster's thesis is that with the transition from broadcast to network communications and new media, the internet has the potential to transform society. Mark Poster takes a look at his theory from a more political perspective, but will also be considering the economic and cultural impacts of the internet as well. And one of the key elements to keep in mind as we talk about new media theory is this idea of network communications as we move away from one-way communication. And so with new media, we get the introduction of the second media age, which moves away from the first media age, which was dominated by broadcast. So there's 6 characteristics that describe both the ages, and we'll take a look at those. That first characteristic is centralized versus decentralized production. And so centralized production in terms of broadcast in the first media age it's very localized and it's very structured and it's very limited. And when we get to the second media age, we have many producers and many consumers. And so we have the introduction of citizen journalism, where everyone is a reporter and anyone can produce content. In the first media age, we also have one-way communication, where media is communicating to an audience and there's not much interaction. But in the second media age, we start to see two-way communication, where the audience is involved and they're invited to interact with media. And one example of this is reality show Dancing with the Stars. They often ask their audience to tweet their perspectives and their comments, and they often ask to use a certain hashtag and see which couple they want to perform which type of dance, and they display those tweets live as the show is going on, and so it just encourages the audience to respond. And the third aspect of the first versus the second media age is this idea of state control. And in broadcast, it was a lot easier for the government to control media because, again, it was very localized and there were very few producers of content. But as we move into the second media age, we begin to see how it's a little bit harder for the government to control media because there's too much of it to monitor. And so one of the examples that I have is during the 2009 presidential elections in Iran, these protests broke out because one of the candidates suspected some violations, and as the protesters attacked each other from the different candidates, the government banned foreign media from entering to Iran to cover the protests. And not too long after that, local media was banned as well. And the government was also able to shut down Facebook and email and blogging sites and some other forms of social media, but they forgot about Twitter. And so citizens were able to log into their social media accounts on Twitter and share photos and updates of what was going on with the protests, and they were able to cover something that the traditional media was banned from covering. And so that's one of the things that we see the second media age is that it's beyond state control. There's just too much for the government to regulate. The next point involves social equality and inequality, and in the first age we see a higher level of social inequality as televisions were expensive for people to purchase, and not everyone had access to one or access to cable. But as the internet has become more widespread, we see everyone having access, and it kind of eliminates those social classes and kind of creates more equality for everyone, as people can go to a public library and access the internet or a school computer lab, and you don't have to purchase your own to have it. And the next point that we see is fragmented audiences versus more individually oriented. So broadcasts tended to lump their audiences together and not really produce specialized content, but we see second media age, we see social media, and it's all about this individually oriented experience, and it's a lot more targeted content. And one of the examples of that we'd see is Instagram, for example, is targeted toward people who are interested in photography and taking pictures and sharing pictures with friends, whereas Facebook, we see more interaction of status updates and what people are doing and posting articles, and it's a different type of interaction, and people flock to different social media sites based on what they want to experience. And the last point that we see in the difference between the two ages is social consciousness versus individual, and we see in the second media age, we see media catering to the individual and individual experience, and we see social media sites like Facebook creating groups for people who have very specialized interests, and that's not something we see too much in the first media age, where broadcast, again, it was just very limited and people didn't have broadcast shows targeted to their specific interests. And so different types of new media, I've mentioned a few, but some of them are Facebook, which again allows users a very individually oriented experience, and it's all about the individual and how they can express themselves. We also have Twitter, which gives users a voice, as we've seen from the example from the elections in Iran. It allows for more freedom of expression and a voice for people to report things that are going on in their communities. We also have Instagram, which again is a place for people to share pictures, and YouTube, which allows users to post their own videos and share videos and watch other videos, and we see a lot of tutorials and also, again, very specialized interests and channels on those media sites. And then we also have Google, which creates very targeted ads for people, and Facebook does this as well, and they track what users are looking at and what their interests are, and they follow them around, and they put specialized ads on any website they go on. And so now that we've seen some of the examples of new media, let's look at some of the positive influences of each of those, and we'll look at the political, economical, and cultural impacts of those. So a positive political impact is that, again, it promotes freedom of speech for people, and especially in countries where the government regulates the media very tightly. Social media is hard to control. It also is good for spreading awareness of issues and campaigns, because the reach online is much wider than the reach without the internet. And we also have more government transparency, as people are able to uncover more issues in the government, and it's a lot easier to share information and make it go viral, as opposed to days before there was no internet and it was harder to get news out. Economically, we see more job creation as people are getting degrees in technology, and companies are hiring people who can create applications for them and help update the technology. And again, we see the growth of entrepreneurs with specialized sites like Etsy, for example, where people who are crafty and create products can go online and sell them and make an income. We also have cultural influences, again, just the targeted audiences with specialized interests and the ease of access. It's very much ingrained in culture, as anyone can access the internet, and everyone has to be plugged in with their cell phone or their internet, and it's just very easily accessible. And so some of the negative political influences that we see from new media is increased data collection. I talked a little bit about Google and how it tracks user information and IP addresses and all of that, but we also have the government collecting data on individuals, like emails. Things that we think are private are not private. We have economical influences. People's accounts on social media, what they post, it can affect their chances of employment. If they post things that are controversial, an employer might be less willing to hire that person. And we also have the expense of keeping up with the latest technology, because every year cell phone companies are coming out with new products and new computers, and it's hard for people to stay up to date. And also culturally, again, there's that lack of privacy issue as people are posting more and more personal information online, and it gets harder to, especially for people who don't have social media, if they went on and they Googled themselves, I'm sure they would find a picture of themselves or something that somebody else had posted. And so for someone who really wants privacy, it's getting harder to maintain that. So when we look at this theory from a Christian perspective, we see a lot of good that comes from it. And just one critique that I found was when the iPhone came out, people dubbed it the Jesus phone, and it caused the Pope to give a speech not on the evils of technology, but on how much society relies on technology instead of relying on Christ. And so it's just a reminder that our identity is not created by social media or technology, but it's rooted in Christ. And so we see churches adapting new media to further the kingdom. We see the internet being used as a missions tool, as people can raise funds online and they can send e-newsletters to let supporters know the work that they're doing. We also see Christian media, such as Sherwood Pictures, creating movies like Fireproof and Courageous for family movies that have a biblical and good perspective, other than some other secular movies that might not have good messages in them. And we also see use in church as well, as churches are beginning to live stream their services. And someone in college now who doesn't have transportation and can't get to a church can log in online and participate in a church service just from their dorm room. We also see Bible applications and the use of those becoming more widespread, as someone in church who maybe forgot their Bible can pull up the passage on their phone and follow along with the pastor. So there's two main critiques of new media theory that I found, and they're both by David Holmes. And the first one is that new media is not quite separate from broadcast, because all media interacts with each other and they need each other. And so one example of that is newspapers now have online editions, and they've stopped shoveling content from just print, putting that online, but they now have online editions and they link to each other, as newspapers can tease to online extras. And he also says that new media expands the audience that broadcast already developed, and so they both have similar structure. They both deliver news, and broadcast is not completely abandoned because people still tune into the evening news, even though they can go online and access any articles that have been posted. So the outcomes of this study is that while new media has transformed government, just like Mark Poster said it would, it's also transformed individuals and identity. And since society is inundated with information, it reaches the individual in specialized ways. And so there's different ways to communicate with people in ways that they understand. So for example, if somebody is more visual, they can log on to YouTube and watch a how-to video. But if someone prefers to read instructions, they can go to ehow.com and get a tutorial. And we also see that Christian culture has embraced media by creating its own different types. We see this in TV shows like VeggieTales for kids, and movies, again, like Fireproof for adults. And so based on the research, I can conclude that despite the negatives, the internet has had a positive transformation on society. Thank you.